Hello, welcome to Mr. Hendricks Museum Tour for Great Book students. The tour that I'm going to be giving you on this video is of the J. Paul Getty Museum. It is a really remarkable museum that we have here in Southern California, and a great portion of it is devoted to Greek and Roman antiquities. One of the things that I think is difficult about reading the great books is that the literature itself is oftentimes so unfamiliar to us culturally. It's much easier to read contemporary literature, and it really is much easier to be able to find the expressions familiar to us, the cultural assumptions familiar. However, you have done the hard work of reading the great books. You have read a course of literature that covers a wide span of cultures that are very distant from our own time and oftentimes are difficult to understand. However, the advantage to you, particularly when you go to a museum like the J. Paul Getty Museum, is that you will now be able to see many, many artifacts that relate to the cultures that we have read. And so now you can go through a museum like this and understand vast amounts of what you are being shown and find a world that will be very familiar to you. So I applaud you for doing the hard work of reading your great books, and now I hope this guide will be a delight to you and give you some of the reward that you deserve for your hard work. Now, also in this video, I do not want you to think that by watching this video, you don't need to come to the J. Paul Getty Museum. This video is an introduction to you, not a substitute. I want to introduce you to the artifacts in this museum, show you what relates to what we've talked about in class, and in that way entice you to come and look. This is a wonderful museum to spend your time at, and I really hope that you will take the time to come here, to gaze upon these artifacts and find your own highlights. I will show you what I think is interesting, but you come and find what you find to be interesting, and just go with my preparation, having been familiarized through my video here, and be ready to make your own discoveries. Also, I've left a lot of placards in this video. I will skip over them fairly quickly in the video, but just use your space bar, and you can stop the video if you'd like and read them over for more detailed information on the various pieces. I will highlight the facts that I find most interesting about them, but those are just left in there as a way of you getting some more background information on the various pieces. All right, well, what I'm showing you right now is the garden area of the J. Paul Getty Villa. The Getty Villa was built by the very wealthy oilman, Mr. Getty, and he patterned it after a villa that had been found is either in Pompeii or Herculaneum in Italy. And they found most of the foundation for the villa and were able to reconstruct what most of it would have looked like. And so they reconstructed this entire villa, and this interior garden is a really wonderful example of symmetric art. And if you just look at me or look at yourself in a mirror, you'll notice that you are symmetrical. Draw a line down the middle of yourself and you'll notice you have two equal halves. Now, we are not perfectly symmetrical, but the fact that we are symmetrical is a very interesting fact to think about. Okay? Also, you notice many of the animals are also symmetrical. Well, in much of art, you find that symmetry becomes an important artistic theme. And if you look at this garden, draw a line down the middle, and you'll see you have two equal halves. And those halves mirroring one another gives us a very pleasant effect. And so some people have wanted to make light of symmetry or tried to move away from symmetry, but it does seem to be a very fundamental human aspect of art. Does it come from the fact that we have two eyes? Well, anyway, take some time just to observe the symmetry in this garden. Take it in, absorb it, delight yourself in it, and see what you think about symmetry. How does it work upon us? Also, this garden is a wonderful place to see the principle of man taking a portion of nature and, in a sense, capturing it. If you notice, all around this garden are buildings, and those buildings are very beautiful, and inside this garden we have a portion of nature. Plants, water, all sorts of lovely bits of nature, but they've all been brought into a human framework. And what is the feeling of that? What are we doing by taking nature and structuring it in our own forms? These are some more pictures of just the gardens. Notice also the sense in which so much of nature has been brought into a sort of mathematical form. Again and again, I will be pointing out to you the ways in which nature is put into mathematical form in a sort of human construct. And what does that do to nature? How do you feel about nature to see all of these hedges put into these mathematical shapes? This is not the way hedges naturally grow. These bushes would grow in many different ways, but here they're put into sort of a human form. Also, one of the fun things about this garden area is the trompe l'oeil that is employed around the periphery. Trompe l'oeil is an interesting word. It simply means fooling the eye. And if you look at these walls, you'll notice there's actually fake shadows that have been drawn in, as if those pillars were really real pillars. And if you don't focus on it and you allow yourself to be tricked by it, you'll notice it increases your sense of space. It makes you feel that this is a larger space than it is. And in this garden, you'll notice that the trompe l'oeil and the real architectural elements are integrated. And so not only do you have the trompe l'oeil kind of fooling you, but you do have real things there that integrate with the trompe l'oeil to increase the overall effect. All right, now this is another place that the integration between mathematics and beauty and nature becomes very evident. This is what I call a compass rose, and you'll notice a very complex geometric figure here. And in the middle of this beautiful garden, you have this complex piece of geometry. Now, we as moderns tend to put a separation between what is beautiful and what is mathematical. We tend to think that artists and engineers are different creatures that cannot ever really have a meeting of the minds between one another. Well, I think this is a false division. I think it's actually much better to look at nature and to look at mathematics and to draw them together. As moderns, we tend to separate what is mathematical from what is beautiful. We tend to think that artists and engineers are fundamentally different types of people. Well, here you see, in the midst of a very artistically beautiful garden, something that is very geometrical. Now, I think at this time I'm actually going to pause and show you how this geometric rose is constructed. Well, I hope you enjoyed that demonstration. I think that sort of construction is really neat. So, now, what I'd like to do is just get you to reflect on the connection between mathematics and beauty. This is a connection that we see over and over again in great books, even starting with Plato, who, on the front of the academy, it was written, "The one who does not study geometry may not enter. Geometritos midis isito." Now, why was that? Well, it was considered that geometry was a necessary introduction into the world of philosophy. Without looking at geometry, you couldn't understand philosophy. Well, why is that? Is it because philosophy is all about hard thinking and logic and we need to have our logic down? Well, usually when Plato discusses it, he brings in geometry as a way of seeing the beauty and the harmony of the universe. It's not so much just about the logic. It's about seeing that the world that we live in is a world that is structured by ideas, and also to see the beauty of clear thinking. Well, also in geometry, you have a pattern of thought that is in accordance with principle. And throughout Plato, he's always trying to get people to think in accordance with principle, to think in accordance with ideas that are derived from something higher. Well, so in Plato, you have this very strong connection between what's beautiful and what is true, and what is philosophic and what is artistic. Come in close association. Plato even says that people are wicked because they don't study enough geometry, that there's supposed to be a sort of moral impact of studying geometry as well, that by studying the world that we live in, seeing that it is an ordered place, we too see that our souls need to be ordered, that we need to order ourselves so that we will fit in with the rest of the world. In a sense, peer pressure from the natural world. So when you see geometry in the midst of a place of great beauty, don't think that that is somehow a contradiction. The geometrical and the beautiful were considered to be really quite close to many of the ancients. Also, what's curious too is that many of the ancients actually took hold of geometry and mathematics as a sort of religion. They saw that by looking at these principles that you could be drawn up to a very high world of the divine. And so this connection between beauty and philosophy and the divine was very strong. And so as you look at this, think about that possibility of being able to look at something that is geometrical, that's mathematical, as somehow an exhortation to you to follow in the path of philosophy, to follow in the path of ordering one's soul in accordance with principle and being drawn into the world of higher ideas. This little sitting place is quite lovely as it gives kind of an opportunity for you to sit and contemplate and look at the beauty of this geometry. All right, once again, looking at the interior garden area, as I pointed out before, it really is a lovely place just to contemplate the beauty of the symmetry. Also, sadly, the J. Paul Getty Museum has decided that in order to show a good environmental example, they will deny us the opportunity to see the beautiful water here and experience the beauty of the calming effects of the water. Water has been used again and again throughout history for its calming and its lovely reflective characteristics, and that has been denied us. So, here's another picture from above of the garden area. Also, just take time to walk around in this space. Take time, just stroll here. And as you get tired walking through the museum, come back to this area. Sit down, enjoy, take time to rest your body and absorb the wonderful beauty around you. Also, as you go from the garden area into the central courtyard, take note how beauty continues to surround you. If you look up above and look at the ceiling, you'll see not just beauty, but the beauty of nature continues to be used. In a sense, on the one hand, nature is formed by man's mathematical will, but then also here, even in the midst of man's creation, nature is abundant. And the beauty of nature spreads all around. So also, take time to look at the floors. The floors, you're walking on them, but they too are things of real beauty. And I hope you'll notice that the floors are created of all sorts of different types of marble. Marble is a really amazing stone. It comes in many, many different colors. And I hope as you walk around the museum, you'll take time just to look at the many, many different colors of marble that are there to delight in. This also is a wonderful way that you see taking the beauty of nature, putting it into a sort of mathematical form, and creating a sort of compromise or cooperation of man's beauty and the beauty of nature. All right, the next room that we are going to go to is the central court. And that's this area here. If you notice the central court area, this area is actually really quite lovely. This also is another place to reflect on this tendency to take the beauty of nature and enclose it in man's space. Now, if you look up above here, you'll notice there's no roof. Now, if you were a practical builder, you would look up there and you'd say, I could cover that with a roof and have a tremendously increased amount of enclosed floor space in this building. This building is a great big donut. And if you covered that interior space, you could have more interior space. They didn't do that. And why? Why would they choose to create more building so that you could have a centered out hollow area here? Well, this once again was very important to them. They wanted to have this interior space that was a place of retreat. And you see this in many Roman buildings. There's this central courtyard. You'll have the building surrounding the central area where you'll have beautiful natural things, water, plants, statues. And why did they enjoy this so much? Well, was it because the Romans were an oppressive society that always had to keep themselves protected, and if they were going to enjoy nature, they had to confine it in this kind of prison that they were in? Well, that would be the dark side of things. I think Romans were also just very, very busy people. And when you work really hard, you need to rest hard. And you need places of very great serenity. And so creating these interior spaces, I think you'll find is really very relaxing. It's very, very comforting to have these spaces. And so once again, take time just to sit on the benches, feel this space. It's a really delightful experience. All right, the next room that we're going to go into is the room of Dionysus in the theater. This is over here, room 114. And everything here relates to the theater and Dionysus. And this first piece that I want to show you also relates to Thucydides. If you remember, Alcibiades mutilated the Hermae. At least he was accused of it. Whether or not he actually did it, that's another matter. But here, this is actually a herm. Now, herms were statues that would be placed along roads as sort of mile markers. However, they were fairly simple. They usually had a head and then just the genitals. Well, it was the genitals that Alcibiades and his drunken friends went and mutilated right before heading off on the Sicilian campaign. So this is a herm, and you can see what that sort of statue is like. All right, now this is the room of Dionysus, and Dionysus, you should understand, is the party god. He is the god of wine and revelry, and this wine container is actually a very good illustration of that. The figure there that you see in the front is actually Dionysus, and he has his hand pointed over his shoulder, pointing back towards the wine, as every host of a party does, inviting everyone to come and participate in the partying and drinking of the wine. And so he's actually gesturing back to the wine itself there. And if you look more closely, notice the wonderful silver details here. These silver details are just lovely. They really have a great deal of precision that's put into this construction. This is, I think, a bronze container, and all of this would have been made by hand without modern CNC machines or things like that. But it's really lovely, lovely construction. And so also just take time to observe the beauty of the construction that you see here. All right, also in the Dionysus room, you'll find these wonderful paintings. And I'll have to say, paintings are always something that I find particularly lovely. And they are rare. To have ancient Greek or Roman painting is a rare thing because paint is lacks such durability. Yet you see some really remarkably preserved examples here. And if you look around at most of the statuary that you'll see, whether it's Greek or Roman, most of the time it's simply white marble. And I'm not sure exactly whether or not the ancient statuary was always painted or just sometimes painted, but there were times that the ancient statues were painted. And so even though to us they look just like white marble, you have to realize these statues oftentimes were painted. And so even these white marble statues that you see, you have to imagine that at least some of these were painted. And so getting a sense for what the use of color was like for the ancient Greeks and Romans is really lovely. And you'll find most of the time it's very almost childlike, very bold colors. And in this picture here, you see the bold reds. Also notice the lovely perspective. You have to realize this is long before the Middle Ages, where you had, oftentimes a flattened perspective. This is very much 3D perspective. And so you can see the inspiration that was had during the Renaissance to go back to this sort of ancient 3D perspective. There's another lovely piece here as well. Also, once again, notice the delight in nature. The peacocks, the grapes, the vines surrounding the lady here. Even up the curlicues up in the top border are also very natural in nature. All right, this is a very interesting piece in the Getty Museum. It's what they call the Elgin chair. And you have to know about Lord Elgin. He's a very controversial figure in archaeology. Lord Elgin was the ambassador to Turkey from England during the 1830s. And he actually went to Greece, which was occupied by Turkey at that time, and purchased from the Turks a number of very valuable Greek artifacts. And the marbles in the frieze of the Parthenon were some of those. And he took them back to England, and they were put on display in the British Museum and have been there ever since. Well, but 10 years later, the Greeks threw off the Turks and no longer had the Turks occupying them. And when that happened, they realized that the marbles in the Parthenon were taken, and they've been incensed ever since then. And if you go and visit Greece today, you'll probably see pamphlets and things like this showing or talking about the injustice that the English still have the Parthenon marbles. Well, this chair here is not from the Parthenon, but it is from the Acropolis in Athens, and it's from the Theater of Dionysus, which is just down on the side of the Acropolis. And this chair is... well, I would like to tell you that this is a chair where people sat when they watched the plays of Sophocles and Aeschylus that we read. However, that's probably not correct. This Theater of Dionysus over on the side of the Acropolis is actually a later theater. The theater where they watched those plays is most likely on the other side of the Acropolis. The theater over there was actually a simpler theater, just wooden bleachers, and when Sophocles and Aeschylus were performing, that's probably where those plays were performed. However, if there were later productions, people may have sat in this chair, in these chairs while watching the plays of Sophocles and Aeschylus. Now, the really interesting thing about this chair is its patriotic character. This is very much an Athenian chair, and the people that are shown on this chair very much relate to the big events of Athenian history. Now, over on this side, we have Theseus killing an Amazon. Here you have Theseus, down here is the Amazon, and this is one of the stories of Athenian lore. Theseus really is the George Washington figure for Athenian history, and as he attacks this Amazon, he is defending Athens. And so you have to understand this is very much a sort of patriotic figure for Athenian history. Also, if you look over here, the wreath is a victory wreath, and so this is also another sort of patriotic themed element here. And over here, you have Aristogiton and Harmodius. These also are very influential in Athenian history because Aristogiton and Harmodius were the ones who, by slaying the brother of the tyrant, helped to establish democracy in Athens rather than tyranny. And so there's Aristogiton and Harmodius. If you remember that story we read in Thucydides, he recounts that story. All right, and so that's our Elgin chair. Now, you'll notice also in this room we have some lovely examples of Greek face work. Now, the Athenians were very well renowned for their work in pottery. And Greek pottery has actually been found, or actually specifically Athenian pottery, has been found all around the Mediterranean. The curious thing about it is that they can actually identify which clay pit it came from. each clay pit has a unique mineralogical content. And if you find a piece of pottery, you can analyze the mineral content of that pottery and tell not only what country it was from, but most likely which pottery shop that it came from, which is really quite fascinating. All right, well, the Getty has a very nice guide to Greek pottery, and you want to get that guide because there are all sorts of different shapes to this Greek pottery. The Greeks had specific shapes for each different sort of activity. There was a shape for wine vessels, a shape for libation cups. All of these different uses had different shapes, and so you want to be able to identify those different shapes and see what each thing is for. Also, I want to take an example of the many different scenes that are shown. Oftentimes you'll be able to recognize these scenes. This next one here is actually interesting. This is a picture of Dionysus over here, and then a comic actor and a satyr type figure, and then this little winged figure is a sort of Cupid or Eros figure. And I would like to actually take a little time here to show you some of the differences in the periods of Greek pottery. And you can kind of tell whether or not pottery is older or newer on the basis of the style. And some of the oldest Greek pottery is what we call the geometric style. And if you look at it, you can very easily identify why this is the case. It is very geometrically oriented. It has basically all geometric elements, lines, circles, hash marks, squares. And so you'll see very little organic presentation. Well, as time goes on, you get more and more organic presentation. In this example here, you see geometric patterns, but at the same time, a lot that is beginning to be organic. You see birds and dogs, and the geometry is getting to be more organic too. You have these curlicues. However, you still notice how much geometry is there. Okay? Now, it's also fun to think about this pottery in terms of Plato, where Plato's put so much emphasis on geometry as being a source of beauty, and you see it's a very ancient Greek tradition, that geometry was considered beautiful, right? That it had its own beauty to it. All right, as you go on, you have pottery like the vessel I just showed you, where the geometric elements get suppressed and the organic comes to the fore. So here you have the people presented, and the geometry is actually quite minimal. And a very interesting thing here, let me recommend the Getty Museum's YouTube channel. The Getty Museum has a lot of really wonderful YouTube videos showing the process of construction, not only of pottery, but silver and lots of the different ancient arts. And so do look up their YouTube channel. It's really a wonderful channel. And take some time to see the complex construction process behind the Greek pottery. Now, it's interesting to note there is what we call red figure and black figure. So if you notice just in these two examples here, in one you have a black background, in the other you have red background. And so whether or not they would draw with the red or the black is one of the nice things to observe. Also, as Greek pottery comes later in history, what we call the Hellenistic period, you think of the time of Alexander the Great, the pottery gets to be more and more ornate. And you'll start to see more than just the black and the red. You'll start to see applications of other colors, which is very fancy. However, you notice the appliqued color will oftentimes come off. The red and the black are actually in the pottery itself. And there's a very interesting process that they had where they are actually able to get the black and the red to be in the clay itself. And so even if it gets worn, you're not going to lose the image. With these applied colors, they start to wear off over time. All right. Let me also give you a recommendation to the Family Forum, as I suppose there's no reason for you not to try this out. However, I went years going to the J. Paul Getty Museum without ever having gone in here, and now that I have kids, I'll have to say, it's a great place. They have lots of kid-oriented activities. If you're looking for interesting activities for the kids, it's a delightful opportunity for them to be able to have some hands-on experiences. All right, another easy place to miss is this little garden just on the side of the lower floor. And the highlight here is a wonderful piece over on the side. I was telling you before that the ancients really had a love of color. And color is something that you have to remember was really a big part of the ancient art. And so don't think that ancient art was just all white. This piece is not an ancient piece, it's a reconstruction, but I think some of the attempt here is to show you what some of that ancient color might have been like. All right, the next thing that we're going to go to is the Iliad and the Odyssey room, the stories of the Trojan War. This is room 110. And this room is particularly nice for Great Book students. The whole room is devoted to artifacts that relate to the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so there's really a lot of artifacts that you'll see here that relate to what we've read. And I hope that you'll be brave and try to find them all without resorting to the plaques. I will show some of them to you. This first piece here is actually a picture of sirens, which curiously are half female and half bird. Now, the sirens are described as being very beautiful and very alluring to men. You might wonder why such a figure would be alluring, but there they are. That's the sirens with female head and bird body. This I think you'll probably quickly recognize from the Odyssey. If you remember when Odysseus escapes from the Cyclops, his men have to tie themselves to the underside of sheep. And there's Odysseus, or one of his men, tied to the underside of that sheep. Here's another picture. Curiously, the man's head seems to be turned all the way around, but there they are, escaping from the underside there. The eyes that you see, people always ask about those, and I think that had to do with something about scaring off evil or something like that. I can't quite remember. This little piece of parchment is quite interesting. I think it's actually a quotation from the Iliad, and I think it's from about 100 AD. And this is kind of an interesting connection for a biblical history. And the manuscripts that we have from the Iliad and the Odyssey are actually really quite late. If you look at the original writing of the Iliad and the Odyssey being between 8 and 1200 BC. I think the only complete manuscript that we have of the Iliad and the Odyssey does not actually come to around the year 1000. So there's a huge time span between the writing of the Iliad and the Odyssey and our complete manuscripts. Now, if you compare that to the manuscripts that we have from the Bible, oftentimes we have manuscripts within 100 years there. And so it really is, it's pretty amazing manuscript evidence that we have for the text of the Scriptures as compared to what we have for Homer. All right, this next vessel is lovely. This is actually Ajax, and we don't read this from the Iliad. The Iliad stops before this happened, but in the Odyssey, you remember that Ajax will not talk to Odysseus, and it's because they had a dispute over the armor of Achilles, and Ajax lost, and in his despair went and killed himself. Well, here you have Ajax with his body impaled on his own sword. This piece is lovely as well. Here you have Achilles. If you remember, Achilles sulking on the field of battle, unwilling to fight because he has been insulted by Agamemnon. And most likely, I think it's Odysseus there trying to persuade him to come back to the battle. But there you have Odysseus, or rather Achilles sitting on the sidelines during the field of battle. This piece is lovely. This is the night raid. If you remember, what we call the Doloneia, Diomedes and Odysseus raid the camp of the Trojans, and actually I think it's the Thracians, and in the night kill a number of men and steal some white horses, and actually you can see the white horse on the other side, and then come back to the Greek lines. Well, also notice in this one, the curious thing here, notice how Diomedes is written backwards, all right? You'll notice this on a lot of the vases you'll have the names of the various characters given to you. Well, usually the name of the character will start at the head of the character and then go to wherever there's an open space. And if you need to write backwards to do that, doesn't seem to be a problem. Now, you might think that this is outrageous, that you would not write in the usual left to right fashion. However, there were many ancient scripts that not only went left to right to left, up and down. The Egyptian hieroglyphs went just all over. But there's actually a Greek script where it went from right to left, and then left to right, and then right to left, and then left to right. Now you think about that, it's kind of nice. You never have to have your eyes scan back over the page without actually doing anything. But anyway, you'll notice that there's kind of a greater flexibility about the direction of writing. This vessel is particularly nice. It is quite large. You can't see the scale very well from my picture, but those loops that are at the top of the vessel were used to put ropes through in order to move this very large vessel. And it was actually a vessel, I'm sure, for the storage of grain. And you notice the odd sort of shape to it. Well, the reason for that shape is that it was actually placed down in the ground. And by placing it down in the ground, it would take the coolness of the earth and preserve the grain for a longer period of time. And so that shape that you see there is actually quite nice. Also, you'll notice here you have Odysseus putting his spear into the eye of the Cyclops. Remember that story from the Odyssey? All right, now this next is a sarcophagus. And the sarcophagus, the word sarcophagus is interesting. Sarcophagus, flesh eater. Now, why is it called a flesh eater? Well, fairly macabre explanation that you put a body in here and you come back 10 years later and all the flesh is gone. You will just have a skeleton left. So where did the flesh go? Sarcophagus ate it. All right, so that's a very curious word. Now, this sarcophagus is filled with scenes from the life of Achilles. And the picture here I'm showing you is actually Achilles having his armor put on. Here you have Achilles dragging the body of Hector. And then over on this side, you have Achilles hiding amongst the daughters of Lycomedes and trying to keep from going to war. So his ruse was found out and he was still made to come to the Trojan War. The top of this sarcophagus is interesting. You'll notice it's a man and a woman lying next to one another, and the faces have not been finished. Well, it's waiting for somebody to come and purchase it. Curiously, this one must have never been purchased, or they could not have it completed. But when it was purchased, usually you would finish off the sculpture in the likeness of the deceased. I hope you'll take time to look at the mosaics. Now, I've said that painting is very difficult to preserve, and that is true. Paintings usually do wash off over time. Mosaics are not that way. Mosaics are made out of small pieces of stone, and these small pieces of stone are actually themselves colored. And so the wear on the mosaic will not take the color off. Also, these stones are put into a mortar base, and so they stay on their base very well. I think this mosaic here is of Briseis being taken from Achilles. I'm not quite sure. But take time to look at the details of the mosaics. Mosaics, you want to look at them from a farther distance. Don't look at them too closely. They're not meant to be looked at closely. Let yourself stand back and kind of get the general feel of it and let the realism come over you. However, after doing that, then go up and examine them very carefully. The way the mosaics attain their effect is really quite fascinating. If you look closely at a mosaic, you can see the techniques of the mosaic artists. And one of them that I find most interesting is to see the way they establish lines and then just make kind of plain backgrounds. If you look over in this area here, you see how these stones are really not given a sort of definite line. They're just kind of, put here in rows stacked in. But then if you come down here, look how this definition of this fellow's neckline is given. If you see those rows of, they're called tesserae, the little blocks. Those tesserae are lined up right next to each other, giving that definition to his face. And so also if you look over here on the edge of his face, these tesserae are lined up right next to tesserae of a contrasting color to give the contrast to create that line. So look carefully and try to just see as best you can the process of creating the effect, the artistic effect of these mosaics. All right, we're next going to go to the mythological heroes room. This is room 109 up here. And in this room, you primarily have stories of Heracles, or Hercules as we call him. However, in the center of the room, you have another very interesting combination of statues. These three statues are terracotta, which is a sort of fired clay. And once again, you have sirens. And it's very curious to see these ladies with their bird bodies. Very interesting to reflect upon the ancient concept of beauty. But the sirens were known for their singing. And here also you have a man who would have had a harp in his lap. And so he is also a sort of musician. And so these were actually from a grave, and obviously from someone who loved music and wanted to have his grave reflect his musical love. Now, I hope that you'll take time to look around all the different adventures of Hercules. The great deeds of Hercules or Heracles are on many of these vessels. Here you see him bringing back this boar. And the funny thing is here, you have the king has gone into hiding. And if you remember that great big vessel I showed you, here you can see one of those vessels down in the ground. Okay? If you remembered, I told you those vessels were placed down in the ground to moderate the temperature of the contents. And there it is, placed down in the ground there. Also, slaying of the Hydra. And Heracles can be identified usually by the lion skin that he carries with him. And this is kind of another fun game to play with these statues, is that most of the time the ancient gods and goddesses you can identify through their particular characteristics. And if you see a fellow with a lion skin, it's almost always Heracles. And so here he is with carrying his lion skin. Also notice how you have this large stump right next to his leg. You have to realize that is actually a part of the structure of the statue. It's giving it additional support so that this leg would not so easily break off. One of the reasons why the statue is still intact. Over on here, this side too, the lions, the drapage from the lion attaches itself as well. Just a sort of a structural safety net to keep it from ever being toppled over. Also the Nemean lion here. All right, next we're going to go to this little room up here, which is actually the temple to Heracles. It's a very small temple, but nonetheless a lovely little place that Mr. Getty has created for us. One of Mr. Getty's favorite pieces was this Lansdowne Heracles, and I think it's one of the first pieces that he bought, but a very nice piece. And there's a kind of an interesting tale behind this. If you look at the plaque, it will actually show you where his various body parts have been fixed. Originally, he was not complete, and so there were artists that came in and fixed him. And later, there was a sort of a reticence about this, that it was thought that you should not fix an ancient statue, that you should let it be authentic, because we want to have a sort of experience of what is really historical. And you start fixing things, and pretty soon you're simply don't know what's history and what's our own manufacture. So the fixed parts were removed. Well, after further reflection, others thought, you know what? Those fixed parts that we had, that were put into the statue, were actually part of history as well. And so we should preserve those parts that had been placed in as just part of the historical story. And so they were put back in again. Well, I hope this all gets you to think a little bit about the story of Theseus' ship. And if you remember in Plutarch when we read how Theseus' ship was always having boards replaced, and soon every board had been replaced. And when people went down and were tourists in Athens and paying their, tetradrachma to go and see this ship, you have to ask, are we seeing Theseus' ship anymore? Well, this is always a sort of issue that dogs archaeologists, because the archaeologists are trying to have us experience something of history. But in history, things would have been repaired. And if we have something today and we don't repair it, are we really being authentic to the practice of history? Also, with archaeological ruins, if you don't repair them and leave the walls exposed, oftentimes they become degraded. And so to keep something up, you have to repair it. Well, this gets all sorts of debates going. And this Lansdowne Heracles is a very nice example of that debate. How much do you repair it? How much do you leave it? What's really the authentic historical experience? All right, also, I hope in this room here you'll take time just to observe the really beautiful floor. The floor in this room is really quite stunning. It is another one of these compass roses, and you'll notice that if you just stand and gaze at it, it is overwhelming. All of the mathematical detail kind of swirls around you, and you just can take time to absorb it. Also, notice the really fine craftsmanship of this floor. If you look at the cracks between all of those little pieces of marble, there's hardly a one where you can see any space. That takes very careful craftsmanship to do. And this is, of course, a modern floor. It's not ancient Roman or Greek, but it's done very much in the spirit of those ancient floors. And it's a really wonderful piece of work. Now, I would like to back up here and just tell you a little bit about ancient statuary. Ancient statuary is kind of goes through a progress of its own. And I'm not really an art history person, but there's a few basic things that you can see that will help you be able to look at statues, take note of certain things, and be able to kind of have a general sense for whether or not it's a really old statue or a not so old statue. And one of the things you'll notice about the very old statues is they tend to be more like pillars. All right? And this is actually an example not from the Getty Museum, this is actually from Turkey. But this is typical of the older statues, where it is cut from just a solid block of marble, and the statue is cut in a very solid way. You'll notice that arm that's next to the statue here is actually connected, and so it's very solid. And you notice here the arm that wasn't connected has broken off. This is often typical. But also, you notice too, not only is the statue very solid like a pillar, it's also not going anywhere. She's just standing, and she's not really going to move anywhere soon. And so she's very solid, she's very static. Also, the clothing is really dominant. You really can't see her body at all. Okay? The clothing is what's dominant. Also, she tends to be stylized, which means it doesn't look like a particular individual. It's a sort of generic human face. Now, also here, she is painted, which is very interesting. You have to say the paint here is speculative. Oftentimes, we really don't know what the paint looked like, but to have them painted is very probable. Now, if you go later in statuary, you notice that there starts to be more motion. Now, these are actually statues from Delphi in Greece. This is Cleobus and Biton. Cleobus and Biton, you may remember from Herodotus, the two young men that carried their mother to the temple in the cart, or they pulled the cart themselves. And when they got there, they were blessed because of their great deeds as sons. So this is Cleobus and Biton. Now, you also notice the static character of them as well. They're very static. They could very easily be carved out of a thin piece of stone. But there's a little bit of motion, all right? You see a little bit of motion there. And also there's not a lot of muscular definition. Okay? This is a sort of generic shape to the body, but not a lot of detail put into the portrayal of the body. Now, this is actually a figure from the Getty Museum. And this also, you start to see more muscular definition. You see that foot step forward. Looks like the statue's going somewhere. But it's still very much a pillar. All right. Now, there is a curious story about this statue. It looks like the J. Paul Getty Museum got had on this one. Sadly, the J. Paul Getty, well, let me just back up a little bit and talk about the J. Paul Getty Museum. The J. Paul Getty Museum did not have any conquerors to fill its halls. And if you go to France, you go to England, most of the really fine pieces of art got there because there was a Napoleon or some conqueror that went in and took items from another country. And actually during World War II, Hitler was building a huge art museum where he was going to bring everything back from all the European nations and make his grandiose museum. Well, Mr. Getty did not have any conquering armies behind him, but he did have money. And he was able to purchase things. He was the Bill Gates of the 1950s and just had huge amounts of money. And so he could go to auctions, and if Getty showed up at an auction, he got what he wanted. So he had vast amounts of money to spend on these items. Well, but how do you know that what you're purchasing is actually authentic? Somebody tells you they dug it out of the ground somewhere, but how do you know it's real? Well, the Getty Museum got taken a couple times, and this is one of those examples. It's most likely a forgery. There's also, there were items that the Getty Museum had that were not forgeries, but they did not have what's called, I think, proper provenance or something. Anyway, the Getty bought it from people who did not have it legally. They actually dug it up and did not notify the governing authorities, went off and sold it to Getty, and then the governing authorities came back and said, look, that's actually from our country, it was not legally unearthed, and it's ours. And so the Getty Museum has had to return some of their most beautiful pieces. So the Getty Museum has had kind of a hard history where they had lots of money, but there's not a lot of nice things out there to buy, even if you do sit on a pile of money. All right, so this is one of those examples. Now, as you go farther on, as I was mentioning with the sculpture, as you go farther on in history, you'll notice that the muscular definition gets more and more. So in the statue of Zeus, this is once again in the Getty, at least it's in the Getty at this moment, might be taken also, but you notice there's more muscular definition. Also, the body is in motion. You notice he's had more motion to him. One foot is coming forward. You've had his arms were moving away from his body, and that's why the arms are lost, because it was, coming out. It was easy to get broken off. And also, if you notice, the clothing becomes less dominant. The clothing is actually very thin, and so you can, even though he has clothing on, you can still kind of see the body behind the clothing. This statue is also typical. As you get later, you have a lot of motion. He has his hands in the air. He's stepping forward. There gets to be more muscular definition, and of course the hands have been lost. Okay, that's very vulnerable. You notice the post behind him is once again structural. That's attached to his leg so that the statue would be stronger. And also, this is another piece from the Getty. As I said before, as you get later and later, this clothing tends to get more and more thin as the interest in the body becomes what's dominant. Now, this is probably one of the most amazing pieces of statuary you can find. And this is not in the Getty, this is actually in the Vatican Museum in Rome. This is Laocoon and his sons. You remember Laocoon from the Aeneid. He and his sons are actually taken into the water by serpents because Laocoon is giving away the Greek secret about the horse. Well, notice here the tremendous motion. You have the snake that's twirling around everything. Laocoon reaching back in horror, his sons being grasped by the snake. This statue is really full of motion. And this is the sort of thing that you see as you get later and later in the statuary. Also, just look at all the muscular definition in Laocoon's chest and his legs. You start to see a very detailed composition of the muscles. And this is actually a very remarkable statue. The amount of it that's preserved is really quite remarkable. You see some hands and arms that are knocked off, but a large amount of the detail is still there. It's a really wonderful example. So anyway, that's just a little quick overview of the history of statuary to let you see some of the various trends. Okay, next we are going on to the Basilica. And that's this area up here, 106. And the Basilica is interesting. I have to say it's probably the world's smallest basilica. But basilica form is very important in history, and it's wonderful that Getty included a little room here shaped like the basilica just because it had such an important role. Now, basilica form is primarily a Roman, not invention, but they really popularized it. And if you look at a lot of Greek architecture, like their temples, the temples are oftentimes long and narrow. And the reason for that was because I think the name of it is the roof system was called a lintel system, where you just laid the boards down flat along the top of the roof, and then the supporting members rested on those boards that were laid horizontally, or those timbers that were laid horizontally. That kept the width fairly narrow because these long timbers would actually bend and break if you went too far. Well, what the Romans did with the basilica was to use a triangle shape. And it's called a tie-beam truss, where you actually create a triangle. And because you have a triangle, it was actually much stronger. Because it was stronger, you could get wider. And the basilica grew out of that change in the truss structure of these buildings. And the other interesting thing about basilica form was, even though the Romans tended to use it as a building for civil administration, it was taken up as the shape of Christian churches. And even Christian churches oftentimes were called basilicas. And so that's not a religious term, that's just an architectural term talking about the shape of those buildings. And so Getty's Basilica is very nice to look at. And I hope you'll take some time just to observe this shape and kind of see this sort of familiar church shape where you have the three aisles, and then at the end you have this sort of alcove where the altar of the church would be. Now, in this basilica, you have statues of the various muses. And the muses were the inspiration for the ancients in their various artistic pursuits. If you think about Homer at the beginning of the Iliad saying, "Sing muse," he's calling upon that poetic muse. And there was a muse of poetry, a muse of music. That's actually where we get our term music from, is muse. And so there were different muses that represented the various arts. And so if you look at the figures around this room, they are actually the various muses. The exception to this is the one at the end, and this is actually Aphrodite Hygeia, and she is the sister or daughter of Asclepius, and so she's more of a figure related to healing. However, the rest are the muses. All right, after this, we're going to go here to this room 105 of the luxury vessels, and this is just a room full of wonderful silver and gold items. And this room is meant to show you what a very luxurious Roman room would be like. And so not only the various silver and gold vessels, but just take time to look at the beautiful marble on the walls of these rooms. This was actually very common in ancient Roman times to use marble as wallpaper and flooring. And so just take time to look at the beautiful surround that you have here to this room. It's really a lovely space just to be able to examine. All right, also, just take time to look at the beauty of the artistry of these gold and silver pieces. You know, you have to really take love for the process of creation. And I would once again encourage you to go back to the Getty YouTube channel here. The Getty's done a good job of just trying to help you understand the importance in process. And I think you'll learn to love things more as you start to see the process that would have been entailed in their creation. Just like you don't really love dance until you take it up yourself, or you don't really love baseball until you play it yourself. Knowing something behind the origin of these items will greatly increase your appreciation. This piece I find particularly interesting. We oftentimes read in Homer about pouring libations. And this is basically the ancient equivalent to the mealtime prayer. It's a very appropriate time before you sit down and take your sustenance to show gratitude. And we pray to God and ask that He would be honored in our taking of the sustenance that we have. And the way the Greeks showed their gratitudes to their gods was to take some wine and pour it out onto the ground. Not to waste it, but simply saying that we give back a portion of what we have in gratitude. Now, this is actually a little bowl for pouring libations. Now, you notice the very precise nature and specific application of all these vessels. This vessel here is for pouring libations. How do you know that? Well, there's a little bowl in the middle. And that is where you'd put your finger underneath the cup, so as you poured the cup, it wouldn't slip out of your hands. All right? If a normal cup, you try to pour something out of it, and it's either going to run down the side or you're going to lose it. So this is a libation cup. It has this very small little indent on the back where you can put your finger. This bowl is just absolutely beautiful metalwork, really stunning execution. All right, next we're going to go on to the room of the gods and goddesses. This is 104 over here. And once again here, you have a Herm, as I've mentioned before. Also further Greek vessels, Greek pottery. And this wonderful statue of Zeus. Do take time to just observe the beauty of the sculpture here. It is a really lovely piece. The Getty, as I mentioned before, has lost some pieces. They did have a beautiful statue of Venus that used to be here. Right, now, the next selection of statues are actually really quite small. It's hard to tell the scale from the pictures, but most of these are only about 3 inches tall. And they're all of various gods. And the statues that you usually see are very large, and the statues that you see here are what would be more referred to as house gods. And you might think of them as Aeneas leaves Troy. He gathers up his house gods and flees. Well, it's probably something like these that he has in mind. These would be gods that you would not have at the great cult statue in the temple, but those that would just be kept at home, and that people would use for their reverence of the gods at home. Once again, beautiful silver and gold work. All right, and that is the end of our presentation on the bottom floor of the Getty Museum. I hope that you'll watch the next video, which is on the top floor.